Yeah.
Sit there, it's fine. You can sit over here.
Good morning, good to see you. Any preference for how we line ourselves up?
I think this is good.
Okay, great.
Probably all wondering why I called you here.
Hi.
Say, who is this guy, Kelly? Water sounds good, yeah.
Hi, Allison Silver, nice to meet you.
Good. We're good. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Will Marshall. I'm president of Progressive Policy Institute. I want to welcome you to today's discussion of Rick Kallenberg's important new book, A Better Way to, well, it's called Class Matters, but the topic today is A Better Way to Promote Campus Diversity. And at the outset, I want to first stop and say what a pleasure it is to team up with my old colleague and dear friend Andy Rotherham of Bellwether, a great education analytical shops here in town, to co-sponsor this discussion today. Class Matters is a great book. It documents Rick's long and often lonely struggle to shift the drive for diversity on campus from race-based preferences to class-based ones, and that was not always popular. I think you all know with liberals, his fellow liberals, and he was assailed by them pretty viciously. I got a flavor of that a little bit myself when I was working with Bill Clinton long ago on the Mend It, Don't End It project for affirmative action. So I know a little about what that entails. But I always admired Rick's policy creativity, his analytical rigor and intellectual honesty, and the way he stuck by his guns and used data and research to vindicate his case. PPI prides itself on being a refuge for free thinkers and nonconformists. So I was really happy when a year ago, Rick was able to come and join us and take over as director of our American Identity Project, which is doing some really great work. Timing of this book is really fortuitous for two, maybe three reasons. First of all, obviously, with the Supreme Court's decision, a class-based approach to diversity on campus is probably the only legal pathway. Secondly, this emphasis on class aligns rather neatly with the Democrats' new and very obvious political imperative underscored by the terrible defeat we suffered last November to stop hemorrhaging working class voters, a topic that Ruth Sheriff has covered extensively, and build a new cross-class coalition. And lastly, this, I think, Rick's thinking here gives us a solid foundation from which to stand up to the new cancel culture coming from the right, the MAGA cancel culture, where we're in it. The mere mention of diversity is enough to get you fired by Elon Musk or maybe Donald Trump. So thank you all for joining us. And thank you very much to the distinguished panel here. We'll hear from in just a minute for coming and joining us today. Now I want to kick it over to Andy.
Thanks, Rob. Good morning to all you in the room, everybody watching online. Thanks for being here. This is fantastically important, well-timed, and we're gonna just have a great discussion. It's always a pleasure to work with Will. I was able to work for Will for a number of years. It was a tremendously formative experience, so it's good to be back. Bellwether, and I'm still a senior fellow, so I'm sort of virtually back. Bellwether is a national nonprofit consulting firm in education. You can learn more about us at bellwether.org. We are pleased to co-sponsor this just because of how salient the issues are. Will, let me just say a quick word about Rick. First of all, it's a fantastic book. It's an elegant look at a long history, and I think it does it in a very deft way. I highly recommend it. I will just echo, Rick and I have been on the same side of some issues in education, and we've tangled on some issues in education, but he always brings just a tremendous integrity to his work. And I think, you know, what he ended up doing with regard to this case was one of the more remarkable acts of integrity we've seen, particularly at a time when I would suggest it's in short supply. So it's just a very admirable project. I actually pushed back on this date for Rick. I was like, there's a lot of education people are going to be on the West Coast because some stuff going on. But I realized he was actually prescient because it's the 160th anniversary of Lee's surrender at Appomattox. And you know, and if you look at that, and there's always two things you have to do when you do an event with Will. I have the obligatory University of Virginia reference, which I'll make now, and then a corny Marshall Plan joke. So there's a historian at the University of Virginia has a fantastic book called Ends of War, in which he talks about is like Appomattox wasn't really the end, it was just the beginning of a different phase of that war, both logistically in terms of Lee's army and also what it meant for the country. And we are downstream of those issues today. And I think Rick talks about that in the book, just how, you know, the special obligation we owe to enslaved Americans, how to think about that. But we have one party that thinks that is just ancient history and irrelevant, and another party that maybe overstates how much that matters in the structure of contemporary American life and how we should think about that. And so we have to talk about that. And that sets up the second issue we're downstream of, which is education polarization. And we'll talk about the working class. It is really hard to miss. We have Rui here who's talked about this, the effect of that on our policies, the effect that a lot of Americans very understandably, and I would argue very rightly, see the system as rigged and the doors of opportunity as being shut to them, and the effect that is having on our politics that we're seeing. So I'm really pleased we have such a great panel to discuss these issues. I think like the best thing about this panel is the diverse viewpoints that are being brought to bear on a really complicated question. And as you all know, you go to a lot of events in Washington and the diversity is, you know, vanilla, you know, maybe French vanilla, and if it's really ambitious, like vanilla chocolate chip. And this is actually a really genuinely diverse panel of viewpoints about these questions. So I'm extremely excited, and I'm thankful that you all decided to join us. Take it away, Rick.
Great, thank you, Will. Thank you, Andy. I have worked with Andy, as he mentioned, tangled on some issues, but he is such a leader on issues of education. I'm really honored, Andy, that you're co-sponsoring this event. And Will, I am so grateful to you for creating PPI. This PPI is really a unique place in the Washington landscape. Not only tolerating, but encouraging unorthodox thinking, and with an emphasis on improving the lives of working Americans. So thank you so much for sponsoring. I'm really excited for the panel. So we have Stacy online, Sam, who's going to be moderating, Allison, who will bring a conservative perspective, my friend Rui, who knows a whole lot about this issue and the way the public thinks about it. So I'm excited for that discussion. To kick things off, I'm just going to present a few slides about the book that will kind of set the stage. So I've been researching and writing about the issue of affirmative action for almost 40 years. And I'm drawn to it in part because it is so challenging. If we could go to the next slide, please. And we're gonna do these rapid fire. Okay, so if we go back to the origins of affirmative action, the country faced a really difficult question. With the passage of civil rights laws in the 1960s, what next? Once discrimination is officially made illegal, what can be done, what should be done to address a really terrible history of discrimination and enslavement and redlining and all the rest? And there are two paths that were laid out. The first is the one Whitney Young of the Urban League outlined. He called for a decade of discrimination in favor of Black youth. And of course, that morphed into several decades of racial preferences in order to make up for past discrimination. The second path was outlined by Dr. King. And he also thought we needed affirmative action. He said the nation must not only radically readjust its attitude toward Black people in the compelling present, but must incorporate some compensatory consideration. So he he recognized we can't just pass anti-discrimination laws and call it a day. We have to do something. Next slide, please. And so what he called for was, interestingly, a Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged. So this is in his book, Why We Can't Wait, from 1964. And he had three insights. The first is that looking at a program to provide advantages for economically disadvantaged people of all races does not ignore our history. It's precisely because of discrimination that a program for the Bill of Rights for disadvantaged people would disproportionately benefit Black Americans. The second insight was that discrimination is not the only form of unfairness in American society, that class matters as well. And so he said, as a matter of simple justice, America should be rescuing a large stratum of the forgotten white poor. And the third insight had to do with coalitions. King, even though he was living in the 1960s at a time when white racism was a lot worse than it is today, he held out hope for a multiracial economic coalition that would bring together people across racial lines. And he wrote to his editor of Why We Can't Wait that if there were a special Bill of Rights for Black people, that would not be taken too kindly by white working class people whose condition is not that far removed from his Black brother. Next slide, please. So I got involved in this issue in the 1980s. Democrats ignored King's advice. And at the time, Ronald Reagan was riding high, and in part because Democrats had pursued a policy to emphasize race rather than class. And I wrote my thesis about what was a better time when Robert Kennedy was running for president in 1968. I always say today, Robert Kennedy Sr., given the confusion today. So Kennedy was able to bring together Black, Hispanic, and working class white voters, many of whom had voted for George Wallace for president in a previous election, precisely because he talked about the common interests and values of working people. And Rui and I have a paper coming out on this shortly. But if you were to boil it down, it was Kennedy's idea that I've come to the conclusion that poverty is closer to the root of the problem than color. Next slide, please. So King and Kennedy were very prescient on this idea that class was going to become increasingly important to American society. These are some slides from Robert Putnam, who put together a whole range of data on outcomes by race and by class. And you can see that over time, we made progress on racial issues. Racial inequality has been reduced. We still have a long way to go. But the trajectory is in the right direction. By contrast, class inequality or economic inequality has skyrocketed since 1968 when Kennedy and King were talking about these issues. We moved in the wrong direction. Next slide, please. To make this concrete in the education context, Sean Reardon at Stanford looked at over time at the test score gap. On the one hand, between Black and white people, on the other hand, between rich and poor people in America. And it used to be that the Black-white achievement gap was twice as big as the income gap. Today, that's reversed itself. The income gap is twice as big as the racial gap in academic achievement. Next slide, please. So Americans understand this. They understand the rising salience of economic conditions. And so for the past 30 years, there has been consistently roughly 2-to-1 support for the idea of a university providing a break in admissions, a boost in the chances for admissions for working class and low income people of all races, 2-to-1 opposition to considering race in university admissions. Next slide, please. So Barack Obama famously understood this, and when asked by George Stephanopoulos, did his kids deserve a preference in college admissions? His answer was no. I think my daughter should be treated by an admissions officer as pretty advantaged, and that working class white people, in addition to working class Black and Hispanic and Asian people, need deserve a break in admissions. I was so excited by this. I had been writing about the idea of class-based affirmative action. I went to the Obama folks. I said, I've been thinking about this. How can I help? And the answer that came back a couple of weeks later was, there is no way that Barack Obama can go against the interest groups in Washington, D.C. That are so influential in Democratic politics. And so this idea was a non-starter. And then they said, the only thing that's going to get him to change and to get Democrats to change is if the courts force him to. So that, next slide, please. That led me to a very unusual alliance with conservatives on this issue of affirmative action. So I testified as an expert witness against Harvard and against the University of North Carolina in cases that made it up to the Supreme Court. And we were able to dig into what actually counted in admissions. And, universities try to make this opaque and say we count a bunch of different factors. It's this holistic process. Well, it turns out being a recruited athlete is by far the most important thing at Harvard. And that's in essence, a preference for wealthy students because they stock the college with boutique sports like fencing and squash and the like that end up bringing in more advantaged students. African Americans received a sizable admissions boost. Legacy students, the children of alumni, children of faculty got a big boost. Hispanic students, those applying early action who tend to be more economically advantaged. So it's race and economic advantage that are economically advantaged groups that on the whole receive the biggest benefits. And then way down the list is for disadvantaged students and first generation students. And then famously at Harvard, there was actually a penalty if you were Asian American. Next slide, please. University of North Carolina had kind of a similar set of preferences for racial minorities and for legacies were the largest, and then less significant were those for first generation or those who were low income as signified by applying for a fee waiver for their application. Next slide, please. So as a result, elite universities are racially integrated and economically segregated. So Harvard has a majority of students who are students of color, which I think is a wonderful thing. They also have had 22 times as many rich students, those from the top income quintile as the bottom income quintile. 71% of the minority students, the Black, Hispanic, and Native American students at Harvard came from the richest 20% of the Black, Hispanic, and Native American populations nationally. UNC, I thought might be different. It wasn't. They call themselves the People's University. They had 16 times as many rich students as low-income students. Next slide, please. So I testified in court that racial diversity is very important to have. I think there are enormous benefits to racial diversity on campus, but there were other ways to achieve it than using racial preferences. And so this was one of the simulations that the Supreme Court justices discussed in the oral argument. A colleague of mine, Peter Arcidiacono, a Duke economist, crunched the numbers and said, what would happen if you got rid of legacy preferences for the faculty, children of faculty, and instead got rid of racial preferences, and instead gave a boost to economically disadvantaged students of all races. Well, white admissions would actually decline because you got rid of legacy and some of the preferences for the advantage. Asian American admissions would go up. Black admissions declined a little bit, and I have a little more to say on that. Hispanic admissions increased, and then the economic diversity increased quite a bit, as one would imagine. Now, the socioeconomically disadvantaged students went from 18% to 49%. But to be clear, Harvard's rarefied definition of socioeconomic disadvantage was if you were in the bottom 2/3, you were disadvantaged. So it's not as if the institution would have been overrun by low income and working class students, but there would be more meaningful representation. You don't want anyone to fail out. And so what would be the academic effects? It turns out Harvard would go from the 99th percentile to 98th They complained about this, but in terms of the SAT scores, and this is a group of students who are much more economically disadvantaged. So the fact that as a group, the class is at the 98th percentile in terms of SAT scores is pretty phenomenal. Next slide, please. So there was a dip in Black representation, which I was not particularly happy about. And one thing, though, to point out is that Harvard did not give us access to wealth data. And wealth much better captures the history of slavery, segregation, redlining than does income. There's an income gap in America between Black and white people. There's a gargantuan wealth gap. And so if Harvard and other universities were to consider low wealth applicants, give them a boost, and there's lots of research to suggest opportunity in America is conditioned by wealth. So this is the fair thing to do, then you would get more racial diversity. Next slide, please. So the court ruled in 2023 that racial preferences are illegal. Chief Justice Roberts said eliminating racial discrimination means eliminating all of it. Next slide, please. So some worried that the universities might just give up on racial diversity. Instead, they've shifted to programs that are going to boost socioeconomic diversity and indirectly produce racial diversity. So Harvard tripled its first generation share between the filing of the litigation in 2024. UNC during the litigation had said class-based affirmative action is just too expensive. There's no way we can implement it. Within a couple of weeks of the Supreme Court decision, they announced a brand new financial aid program that was quite generous, going above the median income of households in North Carolina. UVA, there's the mention of UVA that we were looking for, increased the share of Pell Grants from 14% to 24%. Duke doubled their share of Pell Grants. Yale and Dartmouth reported record levels of socioeconomic diversity. So the good news here is that institutions reacted to the Supreme Court decision by doing something, by opening the doors to working class students. Next slide, please. In terms of racial diversity, some of you may have heard, there are places like MIT and Amherst that did see really dramatic declines in racial diversity, and that was very disturbing. The good news is that most institutions, most elite institutions where affirmative action comes into play, did not see much change in the representation of Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous students, according to Inside Higher Ed. So most of these institutions remain steady. During the litigation, they were predicting catastrophe, that there would be huge declines in racial diversity. That didn't happen. Last slide, please. Closing thoughts. So two takeaway points. One is that the paradox here is that a conservative US Supreme Court decision yielded what in my view is a left of center result, which is growing socioeconomic diversity and preserving racial diversity, kind of along the lines that King and Kennedy were talking about in the 60s. Why should we care about this? First, even though I've been talking about a small number of institutions, there's research to find that about half of government leaders and half of corporate leaders come from just 12 institutions of higher education in America. So we want those institutions to be economically and racially diverse. The other is that this college admissions process is a microcosm of a much bigger issue that Democrats face. To my mind, the most successful intervention in the last 50 years has been the expansion of healthcare to Americans. That was a form of class-based affirmative action. Obama did not say, well, wealthy Black and Hispanic people will get a boost in healthcare, and low-income white students will not, low-income white people will not, which is what universities had been doing for years. Instead, they said economically disadvantaged people of all races should receive a better deal, and that I think explains the political durability of that kind of important program. All right, thanks very much.
If it's okay, if you can hear me and see me, I'm gonna remain seated here for our discussion. Everybody, it seems, is talking about the important challenges that are faced in life and learning on college campuses all across the nation. And frequently, this blazing hot topic is diversity, both pro and con in the admissions and curriculum on our campuses. I'm Sam Fullwood III. I am a former journalist, a former public policy analyst at the Center for American Progress, and a former dean of the School of Communication at American University. That's a lot of formers. I'm going to try to serve as moderator for the next hour and a half or so for our conversation. And we're here today, as you just heard from Rick, because of his work on this whole subject of affirmative action, diversity in the admissions of students on some of the leading universities across the country. We want to sort of dig a little bit deeper into this. As was mentioned earlier, we have a diverse group of people who are going to talk about this. I want to also, before we go too much further, thank both Andy and Will for putting this program on. Thank you all for inviting me and inviting the panel for what I think is a really, really important conversation. I'm joined on this panel by Stacey Hawkins, who is a professor of law at Rutgers University, and who's joining us through the amazing technology of Zoom. Rui Teixeira is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and co-editor of the Liberal Patriot. He and I were colleagues at CAP. We shared an office for a brief amount of time, and we have discussed, debated, agreed, and disagreed on this and many other topics over the years. Allison Salmon is a senior legal fellow at the Pacific Legal Foundation. And of course, Rick Kallenberg, whom we all know now, director of PPI's American Identity Project and the author of Class Matters. I want to begin, if I might, by asking each of our panelists to sort of stake out what their positions or role might be in this important discussion. And then I have a series of a great deal of questions. Unfortunately, very few answers or solution to the quandary, contradictions, and challenges of grappling with race, class, and diversity in the 21st century. Some of my questions are philosophical, some of them are practical. But before we get to that, and before we get to your questions, I want to ask our panelists to react to Rick's comment. I'd like to begin, if we can, with Stacey.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone. Thanks in particular to Rick for inviting me to be a part of this program and this conversation. As I was waiting for the program to begin and looking at the kind of hold screen for PPI, I noticed that the tagline for the Institute is radically pragmatic. And it's so funny because that's how I often think of and even describe myself, as radically pragmatic. And so while I am a consistent champion of diversity, and in particular racial diversity across a number of contexts, but in particular in higher education admissions, particularly among selective schools, as Rick said, and for the reasons that Rick acknowledged, I'm not at all opposed to efforts that target, class or socioeconomic status in admissions. And I think that in terms of the efforts to achieve diversity, including racial diversity, I think all good ideas should be on the table. And I don't dispute that this may be one of those good ideas. But what I do, I think, push back on is the notion that class or SES can supplant considerations of race. In admissions or more generally in our attention to issues of diversity or equality in our society. I have always been a both and person. I am not an either or person. I think that we tend to live in a binary world where we think our options are either this or that. And I think that the way that this is posed is that it's either class or race. And I reject that premise. I think that it is both class and race that we have to attend to.
Thank you. Turn to Allison.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I enjoyed reading this book and learned many new facts about this debate that I hadn't heard before. As was mentioned in the introduction, I work at the Civic Legal Foundation, where we uphold the values of individual liberty and liberty of government. We've been active in challenging the unlawful use of race preferences in admissions, mostly at the K through 12 level, though we've also filed an amicus brief in the Students for Fair Admissions case, upholding the values of equal protection, equal opportunity there. My view on class preferences is we don't have a strong institutional position at the Pacific Legal Foundation on class preferences, except in as much as there might be some entities that are using class preferences to try to get around legal prohibitions on race preferences. In the wake of the Students for Fair Admissions decision, there were a lot of conferences, statements by various actors in the higher education system. They're disappointed with this decision. They want to try to find a way around it, and various ways around it were proposed. Putting a thumb on the scale for students of lower socioeconomic backgrounds might seem like a way to try to get the racial demographics they wanted without quite directly discriminating. As I said, I don't have a problem with socioeconomic preferences if the real goal at stake is socioeconomic preferences. I do think that they're potentially unlawful if universities, schools are just using them to try to do race preferences by other means.
Rui, I'm gonna ask you to talk a little bit about the political landscape that sort of undergirds this whole conversation, based on polling and your expertise in looking at those kinds of issues.
Sure. Well, as Rick mentioned, I mean, there's no getting around it. Race-based preferences are extraordinarily unpopular. I mean, I just don't think that could be emphasized enough. They've been unpopular for decades. They aren't getting any more popular. And this is true, across the board, right? In terms of economic status, certainly among the working class, and also by race. I mean, even among Black voters, race-based affirmative action is not popular. They're much more enthusiastic about, they basically endorse the idea most decisions can be made on the basis of merit. I mean, there was a series of, I think it was Pew did a study of what do you think should matter in college admissions, and everybody says, test scores should be important, grades should be important, but very few respondents would say that race should be important. So this is among the broad public and particularly among the working class. And simultaneously, as the Democrats have sort of tried to hold the line of this stuff, pushed, not only race-based affirmative action, but to some extent what's closely associated with which is DEI, they become less and less popular among non-white working class voters, i.e. non-college, non-white voters. So the big change in the Democratic coalition since 2012 is a radical decline in support among non-white working class voters. The Democratic advantage has crashed by 37 points, even as their support among white college-educated voters, for whom, are actually the most likely people to support race-based affirmative action, has gone up by 17 or 18 points, depending on the data you look at. So this is pretty weird, right? I mean, you'd think that Democrats, if diversity in this sense was popular, would be doing better among non-white working class voters, but they're not. And that's because this whole approach is not popular and does not strike people as fair. What people want is opportunity. What people want is to be able to work their way up in the world. They want to be judged by their merit. They want to have the opportunities to acquire merit. But, and that, can connect to this whole idea of class-based affirmative action. If you're disadvantaged, you should get a little extra help. But the idea that someone would be favored simply on the basis of the color of their skin is really, to some extent, anathema to most working class voters, including non-white working class voters. So the political challenge for the Democrats, I think, is clear at this point. They're hemorrhaging working class voters, especially among non-whites, and they need to, promulgate a different approach that is essentially universalist, that is trying to help working class people of all races. And we know from various academic work, if you frame policies in terms of racial effects, it actually attenuates their popularity. If you frame them in terms of universalist uplift, they tend to be more popular. So Democrats have work to do in terms of, pushing that idea forward and saying Democrats are the party for you, median working class voter, whatever your race, because we stand for these fundamental universalist principles. We're not going to favor anybody simply because of the race they were born into. So, and that connects too to this whole issue of DEI, because DEI, to the extent it's unpopular, there's sort of mixed results on how people feel about DEI. But the thing that people really don't like about DEI extent they don't like it, is this association with various forms of what appear to be racial preferences. Because again, they think people should be judged on their merit, not on the basis of the color of their skin. So Democrats need to make a decisive break with this, their old way of looking at things, the sort of fervent defense of racial preferences, which is still very common in upper reaches of the party and in many NGOs, advocacy groups, and so on. As Rick was pointing out, he thought, hey, I've got this opening here with Obama. He's for, class-based affirmative action. Let's do this. Comes back to, no, the groups, we can't do it. And I think hasn't changed that much today. Who are the Democratic politicians out there today who are actually following up on the Supreme Court decision and saying, yeah, we need a completely different approach here. We need class-based affirmative action, race-based affirmative action. Maybe it was necessary for a while, but it's not going to work anymore. And we have to have a completely different approach that reflects the actual disadvantages that are most important in American society today. They're not there, as far as I can see. Maybe Rick, you know of some prominent politicians who've said anything different, but I'm not seeing it. When Jamie Harrison resigned from, he was head of the DNC at the time when that decision came down. He was like, hair on fire. This is, return to racial segregation. This is incredibly reactionary. And there were similar quotes from lots of other prominent Democrats. So I think from a political coalitional perspective, this is a very serious problem for the Democrats. And if they can't find their way forward to taking a position on something as popular as this with working class voters, they're going to have a hard time rehabilitating their image.
Before we move on to questions, I want to give Rick an opportunity to respond to what each of the panelists have said about it. I don't think I heard, listen very carefully, but I don't think I heard any pushback against what you are proposing.
Oh, I heard some.
Okay, well,
So first of
respond
all-
to that, please.
First of all, amen to everything Rui said. We're in complete agreement. In terms of any Democrats out there, I was actually encouraged that in reaction to the Supreme Court decision at the time, Joe Biden said it's time to shift from diversity to adversity. The idea that, someone who overcomes obstacles deserves extra consideration.
Yeah, but does
But
he
there
remember
wasn't-
saying that? Oh, that was mean, sorry.
But to your point, there wasn't any real
Yeah.
substantive follow-up. So I'm still waiting for that Bobby Kennedy figure. And in terms of Stacey and Allison's comments, I mean, from what I heard from Stacey was let's do both race and class. And I think Allison, if this is fair, if racial diversity is part of your goal in supporting class-based preferences, it is part of my goal, that would be as bad as racial preferences. And so Stacey says do both, Allison's saying do neither. And I guess I have a couple quick responses. First, for Stacey, I tried doing both. I tried working with colleges to boost, once the Supreme Court back in 2003 said racial preferences are here for 25 years, I said, well, okay, let's take that fact and let's try to boost socioeconomic diversity. And Larry Summers, when he was president of Harvard, Anthony Marks, when he was president of Amherst, they did some really good and exciting things. But then the movement fizzled out. And we saw the results, that I displayed earlier. Universities give enormous consideration to race and they don't give consideration to class, as long as racial preferences are one of the options on the table. When you take away race and class becomes the best way to get racial diversity, that's when you see universities do class-based affirmative action in order to get racial diversity. So in theory, of course, race matters in American society, class matters. Why not do both? Universities never went down that path. Now they can't. I mean, that's just not an option to use racial preferences in college admissions. And the other reason, in my view, not to do both is that there are costs associated with racial preferences. And Rui, you cited some of the political costs to the coalition of working class people. This is a deeply unpopular policy. But there are other costs in terms of stigma and the unfairness that people associate with these policies and therefore associate with Democrats. And just quickly on Allison's viewpoint, and again, correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but I think that's where Trump is going too, that he says, if part of your motivation in adopting socioeconomic preferences is racial diversity, that's problematic. And I feel like my liberal friends made the mistake for years of insisting on racial preferences despite their unpopularity. And now conservatives could fall into the same trap, or the opposite trap, if you will, of insisting that anything that you're doing to try to get racial diversity, even indirectly, is bad. And that runs contrary to public opinion too, because people like the idea of a racially diverse, racially integrated student body. They just don't want to use racial preferences to get there.
Allison, do you want to respond? And Stacy, I'm going to bring it back to you in a minute.
Sure. I think my position may be slightly different than the way you characterized it. If the true goal is class diversity, socioeconomic diversity for its own sake, I don't see that as being a legal problem under the current framework or a moral or policy problem. Where I would object is these cases where you have university officials going online 2 weeks after students for fair admission saying, what can we do to get the same numbers as we had before? Oh, let's use class diversity or socioeconomic diversity. I think in that circumstance, they're not true believers in class diversity. They're trying to use this as a tool to get to a racial goal. And I think that's legally problematic under the framework.
So let me ask a question about that. So is your objection to having the same number of African-American students, to say, as they had before with using those so-called preferences, if you get the same number with class-based, you see that as a problem?
The problem isn't the number. The problem is that the Constitution and Title VI for schools that receive federal funding forbid the pursuit of certain goals. And if you're pursuing that goal, even if you're using some other mechanism to get there, that's the problem.
Isn't the difference here then between sort of racial diversity through class diversity as a talking point, or is it on the underlying motivation? If your motivation for doing class-based affirmative action is you just want to maintain racial diversity, that's one thing. If it's like you're basically doing class-based affirmative action and you're making arguments about why this is a good idea, hey, it's more fair, it's this, it's that, it's going to make America a better country. And for those of you out there who worry about diversity, this will actually, this will be beneficial as well, or at least, not change things very much. And so, I mean, why would you object to that as a talking point, is what I'm saying, as opposed to, how do we tell the difference between what the true motivation is and, where it's just the marketing kind of thing?
So there's a Supreme Court case called Arlington Heights for the 1970s. It's dealing with discrimination against African Americans, but the issue is the same in that there were various actors trying to discriminate against African Americans, but sort of trying to hide it. And it offers a number of factors that you can look to in determining whether decision makers discriminating based on race. You can look at the timing of the decision. You can look at the fit between the stated goal and the design of the program. If you say you want class diversity, but somehow engineer your program so that you're excluding Appalachia from consideration of diversity, because it's a place where there are a lot of poor white people, that would raise a red flag as to whether class diversity is your real goal. Timing, if you decide that you want to pursue class diversity the day after an adverse Supreme Court decision comes out, again, that raises questions as to your real motivation. You can find out information about motivation discovery, as we did in the Coalition for TJK Specific Legal Foundation. Sometimes in emails and private text messages, decision makers will candidly say things about what their real goals are that don't match the talking points they give in public.
Stacy, what say you about this?
So much. I'm going to try to be efficient in my comments. The first thing that I want to say is that it's actually false that either the Equal Protection Clause or Title VI prohibit the pursuit of diversity. In fact, the Supreme Court in SSFA versus Harvard said diversity is a commendable goal. It did not deny that diversity, including racial diversity, is a goal that colleges and universities can pursue. Many administrations, particularly, Democratic administrations under Biden and Obama, gave guidance that said Title VI fully permits the pursuit of diversity in higher education. So it is absolutely false that the pursuit of diversity is an impermissible goal under either the Equal Protection Clause or Title VII. The other thing is that while the Supreme Court's decision in SSFA versus Harvard speaks directly to this idea of what we often call racial preferences, a term that I decidedly dislike, but I will accept for purposes of this conversation, but really entail explicit considerations of the mere fact of a student's race when considering admissions. That is what was disallowed. Other ways of attending to and trying to achieve diversity in the student body were not disallowed. In fact, Chief Justice Roberts, in his opinion, said nothing in the opinion, right, would prohibit colleges and universities from taking into consideration the ways in which a student's race might be meaningful and might be a part of the consideration for how they might contribute to student body diversity. And so while these quote unquote racial preferences are disallowed, that doesn't mean that attending to trying to achieve racial diversity is disallowed. It is very much allowed. And there are lots of ways that colleges and universities can continue to do that. And that's what I mean by both and. Yes, we are not allowed to engage in quote unquote racial preferences. That does not mean that we cannot still attend to ensuring racial diversity in our student bodies, in addition to attending to considerations of class or socioeconomic status. I think both of those things are perfectly permissible and should be pursued. I mean, I think that the other thing that I will say in response to a lot that has been said, particularly by Rui, is about the kind of public opinion about diversity. And one of the things that we do in this broader conversation, and it's not just the people on this panel, it's Supreme Court justices, it's virtually everyone who talks about this, is conflate affirmative action and diversity. And those two things are very different, right? And so Rick started off talking about, affirmative action and the civil rights movement and how this idea of class-based quote unquote preferences were suggested by even King himself, right, in the civil rights era as a remedial approach to a race-based discrimination. And affirmative action is designed to redress past discrimination. And as Rui said, popular opinion has been declining in terms of support for race-based affirmative action for decades. However, diversity as a distinct concept, principle, and practice enjoys broad public support, even today. Even after the kind of decade of backlash that started with the first Trump administration against diversity, diversity still holds a majority of public support because we understand that in a multiracial, pluralistic, egalitarian democracy, diversity is important, right? And so Americans wholeheartedly support diversity. The only question is how we're going to achieve that diversity that we think is important and necessary. And again, while we have been disallowed from using direct racial preferences, that is selecting directly for a person's mere fact of racial identity, there are lots of other ways that you can take into consideration how people will contribute to diversity and why diversity is an important goal to pursue in our institutions. And so I will stop there.
That raises a couple of questions that I had to sort of tack toward the philosophical rather than the practical. And one of those has to do with how we talk about and how we even understand the history of affirmative action. And somehow or another, the whole notion of affirmative action, when it was first articulated by President Kennedy, was to bring about a fairness as a way of rectifying past injustices that were specifically visited upon African Americans. Somehow, there was never any intention that it was going to be special privileges for African Americans, but it was to open up the doors to be able to examine how hiring and college admissions and housing and all of these other aspects of American life would not no longer be denied. But over time, we've sort of conflated it to special privileges. Much of the conversation so far today has been special privileges directed toward a segment of the population, which is unpopular. So that raises the question in my mind, philosophically, are we able to say today, in 2025, that race is no longer a problem that needs to be addressed in this country?
No, not at all. I mean, race matters, and that the kind of the soft form of affirmative action that John F. Kennedy was talking about, that Lyndon Johnson was talking about, where there's an opening for a job, and we make sure that people of all different races know about it. That's broadly popular. Even, you know, the Supreme
So
Court has.
that's really the question that I'm raising is, that's broadly popular, but that's not what most Americans, if you ask Rui, think affirmative action is. They think it is hiring a Black person.
Well, I mean, I think it has, in certain contexts, certainly in the university context, you know, race was being used very heavily in the admissions process. So it wasn't just, let's make sure that people of all different races apply. They're actually doing more of that now that racial preferences are illegal. But that's, you know, it wasn't just the soft form of affirmative action that was being used. It was the stronger form. And that's what's controversial. I think that's what's showing up.
So if race is still a factor, how do we address that if we don't make an aggressive and affirmative effort at addressing that?
What's wrong with universalist programs that disproportionately benefit and lift up people of, you know, Hispanics, Blacks, and so on?
Because many people think that that's illegal.
No, it isn't. Not at all. I mean, universalist programs.
I didn't say it was. I said many people think it is.
Well, I don't think that's really that big a problem.
But but if I might, part of the problem with universalist programs is that while Black and Hispanic and, you know, Native American persons are disproportionately poor, they do not represent the majority of poor people, right? And so even Rick's data show that when you just use income, right, to grant SES preferences and admissions, you actually lose ground with respect to Black admissions. You don't gain ground, right? So even though Black people are disproportionately poor, when you use income as a universalist measure, you're not going to disproportionately benefit Black people, right? And so you cannot directly translate SES into some sort of, you know, proxy for race. And that's what people think that you can do, but it actually is much more complicated as Rick's research shows. There are lots of things that you would have to do in order to manipulate the consideration of SES for it to do the same work that direct considerations of race do.
But the result is quite different. I mean, so you can get, I think the data I presented suggests that you can achieve high levels of racial diversity, not precisely the same, but high levels of racial diversity using class. But you do have to be careful about the way you implement the program. So in America, poor whites live in neighborhoods on average that are more advantaged economically than middle income Black people. That has to do with racial segregation in our communities. And so if you ignored neighborhood and just looked at income, that would be unfair in the aggregate to Black people and to a lesser extent Hispanic people. I don't advocate that. I think you have to look at the full package. And in the university context, you do have lots of information about the ways and you know, the neighborhood that a student lives in, the wealth that they have given through the financial aid forms, as well as income and parental education. And when you put that full constellation together, then you can achieve a high level of racial diversity. But to address Allison's concern, I'm not simply saying count wealth because it'll get you 8.2% African-American representation. My larger frame is it's fair. Wealth matters in terms of opportunity, and therefore we should count wealth. And it helps explain why Black people who have talent are going to do well under that system. So it's not a reverse engineering.
Do you agree with that, Allison?
With what he said about the decision to use wealth, I mean, I think this is a consideration that different institutions can use differently. I think there's more than one way to do class preferences, if that in fact is what you want to do, and that's your real goal.
One of the things that Rui said that and Rui and I have had this debate for 10 years. the whole idea of polling and the popularity of race-based preferences strikes me, the whole notion, we could call it color blindness, the idea of color blindness, that's more popular, particularly with working class white voters, because it seems and it sounds fair. But isn't that really an effort to assuage white concerns and guilt in a political context?
I'd say no, and especially since now, I mean, we know that non-white are, pretty unenthusiastic about it as well. I mean, colorblind, merit-based decisions about X are basically the default option for most working class voters, overwhelming majority of working class voters, regardless of color. So no, it isn't just a matter of sort of catering to the racist prejudices, alleged racist prejudice by working class voters. You're basically trying to promulgate a philosophy and an approach that will strike working class people of all races as fair. That is central. And I would also like expand the horizon a little bit of the discussion to take into account, yes, we're talking about competitive admissions to relatively elite colleges. That's only one aspect of the issue of race and class in America. The bigger issues have to do with what is the situation, for example, of the Black and Hispanic poor, working class? How do we lift them up? How do they lead better lives? And the fact of the matter is, while it's important who's part of the leadership class, class-based, race-based affirmative has nothing to do with, being able to lift these people up. It's almost orthogonal. I mean, if you really want to help these individuals, these communities to move ahead, you're really talking about a broad policy issue. You're talking about macroeconomic factors. You're talking about budgetary factors. You're talking about, what is the relative fate of political coalitions between the Democrats and the Republicans. It's a very big issue. And in fact, that's exactly the place where universalist approach and universalist programs have their greatest purchase and a much more effective way of dealing ultimately with these issues than simply with giving preferences on the basis of race, which again, are wildly unpopular, will continue to be wildly popular, drag down the Democrats and their brand among working class voters. There's just no way around this especially once you widen the discussion to get beyond the issue of admissions to elite universities. This is a big, big problem. And fundamentally, what we should be about is making people's lives better who are among the working class and the poor. And what is the best approach for that? And I can assure you that it is not basically to try to defend racial preferences tooth and nail till the ship goes down.
I want to spend in the next 15 minutes that we have before we have to leave with turning the tables and having your questions posed to the panel. I see a hand already. Yes.
Yeah, I'm curious about if you have a slide that shows the current demographics of those universities, because I feel like we're sort of playing around the edges here. And I have to, I went to Chapel Hill, by the way, so I have my own issues here. But when my daughter, who was very high achieving and went to extremely diverse schools in the most diverse place in Montgomery County, had high scores across the board, did phenomenally well. When we did the, what is it called? Naviance to look at colleges that she should be looking at with her full, all the extracurriculars, athletics, everything. It came up with a bunch of colleges that I'd never heard of before. And I thought, well, this is really odd. Like, let me look at your preferences, your priorities when you're choosing colleges. And the first one was diversity, because she went to diverse schools and she loved diverse schools and that's where she wanted to be. And I thought, that tells me something. And then when I talked to the kids in her class and the schools in our area, to those seniors as a Board of Education member, they were shocked when they went to visit all of these colleges, these high achieving schools, and didn't see themselves represented or didn't see the kinds of kids that they went to school with. And it was a big factor in how they chose where they would go to school next. So I feel like we're kind of playing around the edges here. We're not talking about
So could you
who goes to
repeat
the
what the
schools
question
now.
was?
Who goes, the demographics of our colleges right now.
Well, there was one slide that showed the impact that at a number of institutions. One example was Harvard. Look, white students would be a minority at Harvard. At UNC, it's less racially diverse, but still much more racially diverse than economically
Right,
diverse.
isn't that part of the bottom line here that's really interesting? I mean, racial diversity of these colleges relative to the overall distribution of people by race in the United States is not that bad, even if it changes a little bit. But the economic diversity, even with this new decision, is still extremely short of the actual distribution of people into economic slots in this country.
I don't
And
know
that
if
to
that's
me
true,
is
Roy.
like
I
pretty-
don't think that the colleges are anywhere close to the racial distribution of the country. Not even close.
Oh, I don't know about that.
Well,
you
a lot
really
of them
speak
are quite close. I mean, certainly the institutions that are able to, that have lots of applicants that can choose, are
Harvard,
proportionally,
Harvard,
yes.
North Carolina.
Blacks are 12% of the population. If they're 9 or 10% of a college, that's not that far off.
Yeah,
Whereas,
and it's higher than
if
that.
you've got like 2% or 5% of people who are in the bottom quintile of the income distribution, that's way off. That's
Yes.
5 versus 20, right? So, I mean, I think there's no question that the disproportion is much more severe among economically disadvantaged.
Yes, the underrepresentation of low-income students at Harvard was at the level of Black students before the civil rights movement.
There was a question in the back.
Can I just say something though, because I think that, and not that I object to this conversation about opening up selective institutions to a broader range of society across socioeconomic class. But let's be clear, that's not the history of what these colleges and universities have been or done, right? They have historically educated the society's elite, right? And so the fact that they don't educate low income people is not unusual. That's been their history this entire time, right? They also, however, expressly excluded people on the basis of race and ethnicity. They have admissions policies that said, we will not admit even the most qualified, even people who can afford to pay tuition and attend these schools on the basis of race. And so affirmative action came in to redress that. People got upset about affirmative action, as, Rick said, even Martin Luther King himself, right, said it will be more palatable if we say, hey, not just for Black people, but let's do it for all poor people, right? And so if you're familiar with, Derek Bell's work, this was all about interest convergence. This wasn't truly an attempt to say, right, we have a class-based problem with white, poor, and working class people in the United States in the 60s, and so we should give them something. It said, look, the way to get what we think Black people deserve, right, as a function of the long history of discrimination, is a more kind of broad program that will benefit people that will perhaps be less politically, objectionable. So I do think that it's not surprising that when we look at these selective institutions, the vast majority of people that they educate are elite people and high income people. That's always been true. And we can radically reshape the nature and culture and operation of these institutions to be more inclusive of low SES. But that's not the project we've been engaged in, right? The project we've been engaged in is eliminating the racial discrimination that they've been engaged in and remedying that.
Yes, sir.
I wonder if any of the panelists would like to offer an opinion on the comparative administrability and practicality of special admissions programs for poor and working class people. I'm personally skeptical that they're going to be just as easily administrable as, say, affirmative action for traditional affirmative action clients. It's pretty easy to determine who qualifies as a minority under traditional affirmative action. This is why some schools famously, briefly ask for photographs. I'm inclined to think that it's going to be that you are likely to pick up a lot of middle class people, middle class applicants under the guise or under the attempt of attempting to find poor or working class people. I'm inclined to think that it's much more common for families to change their socioeconomic status over time than it is for people to change their skin color. And I'm inclined to think that you're going to have a lot of demographic research on the part of admissions personnel to detect which families have grandparents who either practically or theoretically have a 529 program to pay for tuition programs for their kids. And so I just wonder if any of you would care to offer a more optimistic perspective on the practicality of the class-based approach than the one that I have.
Yeah, I think it's very practical. the College Board was very worried about the SAT going away with the Supreme Court decision looming. And so they came up with this program called Landscape. You type in an address, you get a wealth of information about the socioeconomic status of the neighborhood. Anyone who fills out a FAFSA form or College Board's analogous program called the CSS Profile has to provide a wealth of information about the socioeconomic status of the family. And so universities have this information kind of uniquely among institutions in America. Next to banks, they probably have as much information about socioeconomic status as any other set of institutions. So it's not hard to implement a program like this. What it does require is financial aid, and that's why universities hated it. They'd much rather bring in rich kids of all colors than to actually open the doors to working Americans. And that's where we have some good evidence from states where race-based preferences were banned, that universities did devote and states did devote more resources to financial aid because they do not want institutions becoming resegregated. That's unacceptable politically. And so resources have been forthcoming.
Will?
Yeah, thanks. Rui, you said that colorblind considerations of merit are sort of the default position of the working class and increasingly the non-white working class. But I was just sort of curious, what does the polling show? If you were to ask a white working class person, if your parents were poor, should you get a preference to get into elite university X, Y, or Z? Would they suspend this meritocratic standard and say yes? Or would they,
Right, well, the
show
general
some
idea of
ambivalence on
class-based
that?
affirmative action is pretty popular. I mean, I don't know if it's really been asked in exactly that form. If your parents are poor, do you think you should get a preference to get into,
Gallup asked that. It was 2-to-1 support for low income because it's seen as.
But how was the question phrased? Do you remember? Because I sort of thought that's what you were saying.
Yeah,
But I mean,
do low income deserve a
Yeah.
preference?
I mean, we can argue about question wording, but the extent this has been tested, right? It typically comes back by, enormously supportive. So,
True, but you are diluting the meritocratic ideal that you.
well, people are, they can
People
handle
were-
two things at once, that people should, for jobs and whatever, generally speaking, this sort of merit should be the fundamental consideration. But, as sort of a supplement to that, you should take into account, for something like competitive admissions at least, the disadvantaged nature of the background, right? So that's popular. I mean, there's of course enormous amounts of resources and positions that are allocated on the basis of, merit that sometimes are also allocated on the basis of race. And I don't think there's sort of a move to have all decisions everywhere, everywhere all at once, include a class-based affirmative action sort of component to it. I think the default option of Americans, and particularly American working class voters, is basically we're all about giving the person who is the most qualified the job, period, right? And if there's a problem with like not enough, we want to cast the net as widely as possible to do that. Everybody should know about the position or whatever it is. Everyone should have access to it. Everyone should be considered. But in the end, the decision should be made on the basis of merit. And there's a pipeline problem that became very it's unpopular to talk about for a while. Then let's fix the pipeline. Let's give more people the opportunity to acquire merit, if in fact we're going to decide things on the basis of merit.
Allison's trying to jump in, and I think you have the last question.
I briefly wanted to respond to the previous questioner. While this isn't a legal issue, I do think that class is multifaceted. I was reading about J.D. Vance when he was first nominated to become vice president. He obviously grew up in a setting which had a strong working class sensibility, but his mother's income was actually pretty high at various points along the way. It was reported in his book that she was earning over 6 figures at one point. At the other extreme, there are jobs that are very low income, but that have strong prestige that strongly appeal to people who have a lot of higher education. So I think that practical problem is real. I think the best way to mitigate against it is to encourage universities to experiment, to do this differently. Not every university has to pursue class preferences in the same way or at all.
Final question.
So I'm very curious about the amount of preference. If you look at an admissions office at Harvard new person comes in and is told how we're going to administer this, do we look at skin color? Do we look at economic status? And then how much weight do we give to that? And that's the key to me when you're looking at dozens of factors, athletic ability, math ability, aptitude, whatever. Did you talk to admissions officers or how they train their staff and whether Allison mentioned, is this a subterfuge? If they say, look, we really want to get those race numbers, but let's do it this way, obviously that would violate what Supreme Court said. But if they don't say it, but they imply it or whatever, it gets really tricky and really hard. I know I strongly oppose racial preferences, but I strongly support affirmative action to address past racism. And that's a tricky, a radically pragmatic
How do you
approach.
do that? How do you do that?
You do other programs, the marketing, the financial support, the when they're on campus, whatever, making it more friendly. But you're always going to have
So would you be targeting racial groups?
you
in doing that?
target groups that have suffered from past racism, communities. Maybe it's the zip codes of schools that have suffered from past
Isn't that a
racism.
racial preference by another
No,
name?
he's saying it's
No,
outreach.
These are zip codes of there had suffered past racism. It's not an individual. It's this. Anyway, we could discuss further, but I'm curious again, how this is explained to staff at admissions officers. Do you know, and do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, that came out during the litigation. I mean, they have reader's guides that tell you how to go about the admissions process. In the Harvard case, we were giving a preference that was half to low income, economically disadvantaged students, that was half the size of the athletic preference. So it was a meaningful preference, but it was one that was not as large as.
Was it the athletic was implicit. You measured what effect.
I mean,
Did they give 5 points for your superstar athlete, or they just admitted more if the coach said, do it?
They had an enormous preference, and it was, we were able to quantify the size of the preference. And you can provide a reader's guide that says, you're going to give a bigger preference to this group than to this group, and you can implement it. in that
But I guess what
fashion.
he's asking is, there's a squishy method in which this might have been implemented. Just everybody knows after a while how it goes down.
Yeah.
Or there's like, okay, when you consider an applicant, you give like 7.7 points to someone who's African-American, you give like 5.3 points.
The
in
larger-
some-
yeah,
And
the
40% weight for
larger
the academics
university-
and 2% for
Yes, the larger the number of applicants, the more likely they are to use a point system. Now, that was made illegal with respect to race back in 2003 at University of Michigan. So they don't do it with respect to race. That's more an understanding of what we're going to, what the goal was. So one just final point on your question, Will, about merit. I think there is a lot of evidence that people consider a definition of true merit that examines the obstacles that someone has overcome. And so most people intuitively understand that if you have a certain academic record and you went to lousy schools, you grew up in a single parent home and managed to do pretty well despite that, that all these scores they're just supposed to tell you a little bit about the potential of this student. And so I don't think a lot of Americans see conflict between merit and considering giving a boost to economically disadvantaged students, because they're looking at the obstacles that have been overcome, that this shows grit and determination that someone did well despite the obstacles.
I want to let us end on that note. There are copies of the book. We're here because of the book. It's a good book. I've read it. I don't agree with every word of it, but it's something I think that we really should be thinking about if we're concerned about this whole conundrum of race in our society. I want to thank the panelists, Stacy by Zoom, Allison, Rui, and of course, our host, Rick.
Question.
Thank you for having me.
Not normally how I roll, but.